Welcome back to the Parma Summer School 2021. It's time now to give the floor to Lynn Frewer. She's Chair of Food and Society at Newcastle University, UK. Lynn Frewer is discussing the presentation Societal Responses to Synthetic Biology Applications. She will focus on genomic technologies applied within the food and agricultural sector. Lynn, it's your time.
Thank you. So, the title of my talk, Understanding Societal Responses to Synthetic Biology Applications. I'm going to go back in time a bit to start thinking about how society reacted to GM at the end of the last century and the beginning of this one, and then see what's changed. So a quick overview. Risk communication is part of the risk analysis process. To get this right, we need to understand what consumers think about risks. I'm going to provide an aggregated view of public attitudes to GM technologies, look at some current research in relation to the gene editing of animals, and then ask the question, do we expect synthetic biology to be different? So you may or may not be familiar with risk analysis. We have three components: risk assessment, the process that's used to quantitatively or qualitatively estimate and characterize risk; risk management, the weighing and selecting of options and implementing controls; and risk communication, the exchange of information and opinions concerning risk and risk-related factors between all the different stakeholders, including the public, who are interested in food safety risk analysis. We have a big understanding of how experts and citizens differ in their perceptions of risk. And that has been integrated and considered within the risk analysis process. Experts rely on technical risk assessments. They tend to use scientific argumentation, which infrequently has in the past taken an account of socio-economic impacts, and historically has not balanced risk against benefit. And I think sometimes that's because it's not quite so clear how socioeconomic benefits are assessed. I think we've heard today that the public use their risk perceptions to make judgments about risk. They require risk communication to take account of their concerns, their perceptions, as well as technical risk estimates. Emotional or affective responses are important, as are moral and ethical assessments, and trust in regulators and information. And people also use, we've heard today, heuristics, decision rules, to decide whether information is valuable or indeed whether a risk is risky or dangerous or is indeed acceptable. So how does this relate to technology adoption? How does risk perception influence societal acceptance of novel and potentially beneficial emerging technologies? Novel applications of GM, some examples from the past. Herman the bull could produce lactoferrin, so a kind of human food, pharmaceutical type production, producing milk, which can then be given to human infants. So Herman obviously wasn't producing the milk himself, but he could sire children who were able to do that. An example of a pet fish, which has been genetically modified to glow in the dark. It's quite common in North America. and the aqua bounty salmon, genetically modified to increase its growth rate, so more efficient from a food security point of view. One issue that's emerged as being very important is why you're applying genetic modification. Here's an example from a few years ago, 2017. Scientists deploy GM sheep in fight to treat Huntington's disease. At the moment, there's no cure for this disease, and it invariably results in death. The public are quite positive about these medical applications, but tend to be much more negative. And historically, this has been seen in public discourse about GM, a lot more concerned about food-related applications where economic gain is why the application is being developed. So here's the results of a quite old systematic review looking at everything that had been published about public attitudes towards GM up until 2012. This has been subject to an enormous amount of research in different countries, mostly within Europe, North America, and Asia. What this shows that when these data were collected, plant-related or general applications were more acceptable than animal-related applications. Pharmaceutical production was more acceptable than food applications. However, there were differences in different parts of the world. So risk perceptions dominated decision-making in Europe. Benefit perceptions were observed to be greater in North America and Asia, and moral or ethical concerns were higher in North America and Asia compared to Europe. So what I'd like to do is now consider something that's very topical, gene editing applied to animals. This is topical, firstly, because of differing legislation that's occurring in different parts of the world. In North America compared to Europe. In Europe, gene editing is addressed by the genetic modification legislation. And in my country, the UK, we're just deciding what to do. Is gene editing the same as GM, or is it the same as, I suppose, in regulatory terms, accelerated breeding? Because the argument is that we're not transferring genes from one type of organism into another. Now here's the results of some work which has been submitted for publication. 5 focus groups, it's very qualitative. 4 were held in the city of Newcastle in the UK, and 1 in rural Northumberland, where I live. We considered a range of ages and socio-economic classes across all of these different focus groups, and applied something called thematic analysis, where we have an idea beforehand what we want to code, but we confirm it through coding of transcripts of what people said. And we did this using MVivo, which is an electronic approach to doing this. So as part of this research, we actually compared different genomic technologies applied to animal production in terms of what these different people thought about these. We compared the use of gene drives, and I'm currently looking at this in another project funded by USDA. GM foods, we already know a lot about public attitudes towards GM foods and even how these have been changing over the years. gene editing, conservation genomics, accelerated breeding, and traditional breeding. People generally express the most negative views, the most negative perceptions towards gene drives and GM foods. We heard about the concept of unnaturalness earlier, but the other concept linked with these was the perception that somehow humanity was tampering with the natural order, the way the world ought to be. People were not concerned at all about accelerated breeding using genomic technologies or traditional breeding. They're very familiar, very comfortable with this. We also heard about emotional responses. Negative affect, negative emotion was associated with gene drives and GM foods. And positive, I wouldn't even say positive, I would say neutral affective responses associated with these latter two cases. Gene editing was in the middle. And one of the things that emerged from the analysis was that it really, really, really depends on why you're conducting, if you like, the scientific innovation. Again, if it's for profit, that's viewed very negatively. If it's to improve animal welfare, reducing disease, that's very positive, except for applications which are in the pipeline, which are broadly described as disenhancement, where gene editing makes it easier to raise animals in intensive production systems. An example might be debeaking chickens so that they don't peck each other when they're intensively raised. Polling cattle so that they is practiced so that they don't injure each other. So the cattle would be gene edited not to have horns, or creating animals that cannot feel pain so that they don't experience stress in intensive production systems. So to summarize, priorities and concerns expressed by the public are very similar when considering both GM and gene editing. The type of concern is similar. It seems, though, that there's various differences which are very much linked to, I suppose, a continuum along the dimensions of perceived unnaturalness, something called telos. If you like, that's the animalness of the animal. Is a cow not a cow anymore if you genetically modify it or alter it using gene editing? The big question, and I think this might be true of some of the insect-based research for human food, is are there alternative approaches which can be applied which are more acceptable to the public? Animal welfare is an enormous priority, and that applies to both GM and gene editing. Ethical concern, the concept of disenhancement is viewed very negatively. And I suppose there's a general disquiet or dysphoria about GM and gene editing, but that seems to be very much more focused on GM. Motivation for applying breeding technologies. Financial gain is viewed very negatively. Improved animal health, reduced negative environmental impacts, for example, reduced greenhouse gas emission, is viewed positively, as are impacts on human health. And it's these benefits which potentially represent a tipping point for acceptance of gene-edited animals. Because remember, it's right in the middle. Which way will it go? It very much depends on what comes on stream in the marketplace. So I promised a discussion of synthetic biology and agriculture. I would say that this is not a very advanced area, but it's coming on stream quickly. I've got some definitions of synthetic biology here for you. Applying the engineering paradigm of systems design to biological systems in order to produce predictable and robust systems with novel functionalities, and this is key, that do not exist in nature. Another one, the design and construction of new biological parts, devices and systems, and the redesign of existing natural biological systems for useful purposes. Who decides what useful is? Oops. And then the design and construction of novel artificial biological pathways, organisms and devices, or again, the redesign of existing natural biological systems. And if you go, for example, to the technology acceptance literature, it's this point where ethically and in terms of public discourse, it's predicted there will be a difference between synthetic biology and more traditional, if you like, genomic technologies, that in some way we are creating life. This is one step, according to philosophers, beyond, if you like, tampering with nature. So here's the results of some research that we conducted in China and the EU. Interviews, asking scientists within, if you like, different frameworks for funding, what they think about synthetic biology in agriculture in terms of public response. Now, the big difference between the two funding approaches is that in Europe, we've tended to adopt a responsible research and innovation process. More latterly, the multi-actor approach, where we involve all stakeholders, including consumers, in setting, for example, research objectives and impact pathways. Whereas in China, this has been much more infrequent and it isn't embedded in research processes. Both Chinese and European scientists regarded synthetic biology as being very high benefit, low risk, and ethically acceptable, which kind of isn't unexpected because they're all working in this area. But they nearly all, with no exceptions, predicted its rejection by the general public. This was attributed to the public's lack of knowledge, their knowledge deficit, and their irrationality. And there's something called the deficit model of science communication, which I think was quite prevalent in the 1990s, which basically said if only the public understood the science, they would accept its applications. We also found that many of these European scientists were unaware of the emphasis on responsible research and innovation and the multi-actor approach, which is now being adopted by European research projects, which, is slightly surprising. So here's some work that we conducted in China, asking the public what they thought about synthetic biology. We provided the kind of definitions, but obviously much easier to understand and in Chinese that I provided for you about what synthetic biology was. And then we looked at people's attitudes to different applications currently being produced in China. These are available in the scientific literature. Synthetic biology yeast for producing artificial milk, drought-resistant soybeans to manage climate change and abiotic stressor, and pigs that have strengthened immune systems. Obviously, we're not building these pigs from scratch, but we're using synthetic biology to create a strengthened immune response. And this is the kind of model we got. I'm not going to go through this in detail. This was considering different psychological constructs and whether they're important. The survey was conducted earlier this year. It involved 1,330 Chinese citizens. And what we've done here is used an approach called structural equation modeling to see which, if you like, types of attitudes drove which sorts of responses. So again, we've looked at emotion, perceived unnaturalness, tampering with nature, perceived benefits, perceived risks, and whether these different applications were acceptable. What we did do was run a very similar experiment using genetically modified foods. I'm going to just run through the key results. The first was that people in China certainly didn't reject these different applications based on the fact that they were created using synthetic biology. And this was confirmed in a comparative study on current attitudes to GM. So these different applications that we looked at were not rejected either. Interestingly, we found that perceived unnaturalness reduced acceptance. So the more people perceived that these applications were unnatural, the less accepting of they were of the applications. However, perceptions of tampering with nature had no effect. So unnaturalness had decoupled itself from this idea that using science in itself was some way tampering with the way the world should be. People's acceptance was very much at the same time determined by the extent to which they liked the benefits of the application. I don't think that is news, but it's interesting to see that confirmed with synthetic biology. I guess in terms of risk communication, there was an interesting finding. Simply engaging in risk-benefit communication in itself generates an emotional and effective response when people get that information. So if people have a negative emotional response, that will act as a heuristic or a decision rule to shape people's attitudes. So you have to be very careful when designing risk-benefit communication to assess whether it is generating an effective response. What I will say, if we go back to the assumptions of the scientific experts, they were clearly unfounded. The public made decisions based on these different applications of synthetic biology on the information that's provided about them. Understanding science, I think, is not the way forward to get these applications accepted. And we can't make assumptions that we know what public views are going to be. That requires social science research. So, some conclusions. First, as people are becoming more positive to some applications of GM, genomic technologies, and synthetic biology, we cannot make the assumption that neophobia, for example, by itself will determine attitudes. Attitudes are nuanced by context. You must always ask the question, why is this technology being applied? And embed our understanding of people's responses to that in risk-benefit communication. We need to address people's ethical concerns rather than dismiss them. And these might be very unspecific. They may be an ethical disquiet with a process or a technology, or they may be particularly linked to something that's being done. Disenhancement of animals is unethical. Risk communication in itself may generate an effective response, which acts as a kind of heuristic or a decision rule to shape attitudes. And finally, we cannot, as those scientists did, assume that attitudes to GM foods is the blueprint for future attitude adoption. It's something which will change and will be shaped and driven by the socio-economic context and the perception of the broader environment in which those applications are embedded. And I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lynn, for your insightful presentation. Thank you very much.